Hello, everybody. It is my very great pleasure to introduce such a fantastic audience, see such a fantastic audience here for this evening's talk. This is very impressive. Tom is our speaker today. I'm going to say a little bit about him in a moment. The one thing I will say, first of all, though, and this is not on my cue cards, is that Tom has been a member of the School of Biological Sciences for the last few years, and his presence, not wanting to embarrass him, has been really important to us. He's been transformational in terms of what he's brought to that school, and it's something I'm very proud of as being part of trying to entice him to Reading. So I'm very pleased that he's here. He was enticed to Reading not to to do the work that you're going to hear about today. This has been a development for him. So just wanted to start by that. My name is Mark Fellows. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Academic Resource and Planning here at the university. I'm really delighted to see such a large group of people here today. Thank you very much for coming along. Tom is the author of Self Delusion, the book that you're coming to hear about today. I'm hoping that those of you who haven't read the book yet will take the opportunity to look at it outside. Our Vice Chancellor has already bought a copy, so if any of you haven't come up with any questions later on, I will be coming through the audience and asking you to come up with some questions for Tom. I will make sure to come to Robert and ask. So if you could do that over the next 45 minutes. So Tom's is a fantastic researcher. His history in terms of science is incredibly impressive. He has published a large number of papers, over 65 papers, I believe, in some of the top-ranked journals in science. He works in an area of ecology that's incredibly important today as we face challenges from climate change, and those papers have been hugely influential. He's also a senior academic fellow with the UK government, leading the design of DEFRA's systems research programme to inform environmental policy, and he also sits on the European Environment Agency Scientific Committee. He's a frequent contributor to the broadcast media. Most of the broadsheets, the BBC programmes, you'll have seen Tom on. He's been on Channel 4, ITV News, the Today programme. He's been in all across the world: New York Times, Washington Post, Hindu Times, New Scientist, The Guardian, The Times, The Independent and Telegraph. So these are the kinds of places that ask Tom for his feedback, his opinion, and to hear what he has to say about the state of the planet and how we can influence it. He also gives talks on his research and environmental science to a huge number of public audiences. So it's not just on the topic of his book here that you're going to hear about. He talks on his science around the world as well. Tom also won the Marsh Award for Entomology back in 2014 for his outstanding contributions to that science. And those Marsh Awards are really important. They recognize people who are really making a difference to their science and how that influences people. And I think that really was relatively early in his career, one of those really important recognition of his contribution to science. So the key thing is what Tom is going to talk about today. We often think of ourselves as individuals, and I'm afraid I'm one of those people who likes to think of myself as an individual. I feel that I have some free will acting alone. Tom is going to put me straight, I think, today, and hopefully all of us here as well. His argument, his thesis, is that we have an inner self that stays the same across our life. That we argue that we have this inner self that stays the same across our lives, but that this is an illusion. Instead, that we are more connected with others, that we are more connected with the planet and the universe than perhaps we realize. And that, of course, is central in many ways too, and I think builds on the science that you've done, that it's not just about us as individuals, it's about our relationship with the rest of the planet, with the environment around us, with the people around us, that really allows us to make a difference. And so he argues that while our sense of individual self has allowed our species to survive, that we need to see beyond that mindset. That's the key element in all of this. If we need to understand the complex connections between us and the rest of the natural world, if we're going to make a better future for ourselves and for the species that we share the planet with. And so I've given you some background I'm just going to finish by saying that, again, I'm delighted that Tom is a member of staff here in the university. He's Professor of Applied Ecology in the School of Biological Sciences. I'm going to hand over to him in just a moment, but before I do so, I just wanted to mention that there will be a Q&A session at the end of this. It's being recorded. You'll see there's cameras here. So if you have any issues with that, please do let us know. The plan is that this will be put on YouTube in a couple of weeks' time. And so those of you who had some questions and who didn't think through them at that time, hopefully some of them will be addressed in the talk itself. So without any further ado, I'm going to say over to you, Tom. The stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Well, that was a wonderful introduction. I don't quite know what to say. You mentioned this talk is not on the topic that you enticed me to Reading to do, so I hope I'm still doing some of that research that you expected me to be doing and haven't gone too much of a tangent. So thank you very much, Mark, and thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate your time and coming to listen to this talk. This is a very interdisciplinary talk. My background, as Mark mentioned, is in applied ecology, and I had a passion for nature from a young age, really. I was brought up in Malaysia, and I used to love visiting the rainforest. And one of the things you notice straight away is the humidity and the heat. It's like walking off a plane when you go on holiday to a hot destination, and that heat just hits you like a wall. And the smell, the rich, humusy smell of the soil and the moisture, and seeing structures like this, and actually almost first hearing the noise of these ants creeping across the leaves. Now, these are weaver ants, and they form this nest, and they actually do that by forming chains with their bodies and pulling the leaves together. And to stick the leaves together, they take their larvae, their grubs, and they use them like miniature glue guns to weave together the leaves. And I remember looking and just being fascinated by these ants and how they work together so cooperatively. And you really have to ask, are these ants individuals alone, or is the unit of individual the colony? And actually, ants, the workers forego reproduction, and the queen is the one that reproduces. So these ants really do work together like a superorganism, like cells in an organism working together. After my childhood, I went to do a PhD studying ants and also aphids, these greenfly. Greenfly or blackfly if you're a gardener. And these aphids feed on plant sap, and they take the vitamins and the excess sugars they secrete as honeydew, it's called. If you park your car under a tree in summer, especially a sycamore tree, and it's covered in that sticky substance, that's the honeydew that these aphids are secreting. Now, it's a waste product to them, but it's valuable to the ants. They use it as a fuel for foraging, and they actually they palpate the aphids with their antennae and get them to produce this honeydew on demand. And in return, they protect the aphids from predators such as ladybirds. And if the aphids have some say in this, if they can actually increase the quantity of amino acids, the vitamins in their honeydew to pay more for the ants' protection and get more protection from the ants. And it gets even more fascinating when you study this, because inside the aphids are intracellular bacteria that actually help the aphids to produce and break down those amino acids and then use that to pay for the ants. So when you really start to study these interactions, you see that it's very difficult to say where one individual organism ends and another begins, or where one species ends and another begins. And I started to think about this question, a somewhat philosophical question, I guess. What is an individual? But there is an applied aspect, a secondary question. Why does it matter? And tonight I'm hopefully going to convince you a little bit of this is important. This question is important because it's important for our personal well-being, our personal health, but also the health of our ecosystems. And we'll come on to that more later. But first on with the story, I went on from moving to ants to work on butterflies. These are 3 butterflies that occur around the Reading area. You've got the comma, the green hair streak, and this orange-tipped butterfly. We'll see this one soon, one of our first butterflies that emerges from an egg. And so it'll appear in March or April, depending on the temperature in the winter. And these butterflies are recorded by the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. And this is a fabulous scheme, in fact, fabulous volunteers who work on this scheme, because they walk routes called transects, set routes. And these routes are about 1 to 5 kilometers long. And you walk the route and you record the butterflies in a box in front of you, the species that you see and the number of individuals. And there are about 1,500 transects that are walked every week throughout the flight season from April to October. So across the country, there's this network of sites essentially detecting the heartbeat of our nation's biodiversity. And unfortunately, that heartbeat is to some degree faltering because there's been land use changes. Here's an example of, this is Wallingford at Oxfordshire. This is near where I live. It's about 15 miles north of Reading, halfway between Oxford and Reading. So you may be familiar with this area. I used to walk past this quite often, and it was an abandoned orchard, and it was full of wildlife, hares, foxes, butterflies, bees. And I walked past one day, and it had been decimated. All the trees had been cleared and piled into these 3 huge piles of trees. And about 2 days later, they'd gone, and the field had been sowed with wheat crop, bright green, intensive arable production, very poor for biodiversity. And this is a microcosm of the type of land use changes that are going on around the country. And it's those small changes that accumulate a kind of million cuts to actually lead to the degradation of our wildlife. And I thought I'd probably better get one figure in to show my ecology science background. We can use the data from the Butterfly Monitoring Scheme to try to understand that decline of biodiversity and what are the mitigating factors. This is an image from satellite data. It's called remote sensing data. So satellites above the Earth look down and detect the land use. So you see here the greens might be woodland and the yellows might be arable fields. The black here is a transect, and the red lines are just imposed circles which represent 1, 2, or 5 kilometer radius around that site. So within those radius, we can quantify, how much woodland there is or how much grassland. And then we can ask how that affects butterfly responses, in particular their responses to climate change, so how they're affected by drought events. For example, this is the ringlet butterfly. It's of all those colourful ones I showed you, this is pretty drab brown one. It likes it damp and wet. It's perfectly suited to Britain. And in fact, this species is declining from large parts of southern Europe, where it's quite arid, Italy, southern Spain. But it's thought that the UK would be a stronghold for this species. But actually, when we look and when we think about drought events, and you can look at the historical data, these data go back up to 50 years, to about 1970. We looked at a drought event in 1995. It was a particularly arid spring and summer. And what we've got here on this vertical axis is the abundance change following a drought. So each of these points is a site, and you can see that the horizontal line is 0. So lots of sites suffered population crashes, almost sometimes up to 100% loss of those butterflies on those sites. What's particularly interesting is that that's affected or associated with the amount of woodland in the landscape. And where there's more woodland, those population crashes are less severe. But where we've taken away all that woodland, they're much more susceptible to those extreme events. Now, these woodlands, these big, large woodlands, are acting as a kind of refuge, and they harbour moister, cooler conditions that the butterflies can shelter in. And the host plants of the butterflies tend to be healthier in those drought years. So this helps us to understand how these losses of natural habitat, losses of woodland, losses of grassland, also interact with climate change impacts and driving biodiversity changes. Now, butterflies are great. I'll be the first to try and tell you that. But of course, there's lots of other species out there. Unfortunately, there are about 44,000 other species in the UK. Lots of other species groups, and in total about 44,000 species across all groups. We don't have standardized monitoring schemes for lots of these species, but we do have citizen science schemes. So these are schemes where volunteers go out, whether they're school children or trained naturalists, go out and they see a species in a certain location, and they'll record which species. I saw this ladybird at this location at this time. And that's called a biological record, and that gets sent to databases, which ecologists can interrogate and analyse. There are over 100 million records have come in of different species. And so we can use those to try to understand how biodiversity is changing, its occupancy is changing across space or over time. Now, of course, you've got to be careful because you get more records where there are more people. So, if you just plot these on a map, looks like there's lots of records around London, Greater Manchester, Birmingham, but obviously there's just more effort going into looking for species. So you have to do some quite detailed statistical analysis to start to pull out the signal of actual genuine ecological change. But when you do that, it allows you to kind of produce a synthesis of what's going on in our nation's biodiversity. I was, lucky enough to be partly involved in this. I provided the moth data, which was about 18% of the data that went into this State of Nature report. And you can see there's a whole range of different partners involved in collecting the data and sense checking the results. And this report, it does what it says on the tin. It's a census of the status of our UK nature. And unfortunately, the news is not great. This has been repeated in 2019. But in summary, about 15% of species are threatened with extinction, and there are more species declining than increasing. Now, it's important to document these trends, but as an ecologist, doing this for several years, it does start to feel like you're just articulating the decline of biodiversity in more varied ways. And you want to really think about solutions. How do we reverse this biodiversity decline? And so that's when I got involved in working on projects like this. We set up this experiment. This is at Porton Down in Wiltshire. And this is a flowery field margin. These are poppies that have just self-seeded. But we actually also sowed this with wildflower seed mix, providing food for birds and butterflies and bees. Actually, it's quite difficult. You don't see many other flowers there because it's really high nitrogen, high nutrient habitat because of the farmers are putting on lots of chemicals to grow the crops. So it's very difficult to actually restore biodiversity. And although this looks wide, in fact, this is a 6-metre margin. Most of them are normally about 3 metres or less. They're tiny amounts of land, really. And the elephant in the room is that a lot of our landscapes look like this, really intensive, homogeneous landscapes. And this is, very detrimental to biodiversity. Lots of fertilizers, lots of pesticides, very little natural habitat. And if you look at the statistics, over 70% of England is covered in intensive arable or improved grassland. And that's compared to about 1.1% of neutral or calcareous grassland. So you can see the problem here. As ecologists, there are whole 3-year, 5-year projects, researchers spending lots of time thinking about how to configure these field margins. I've done it myself. How can you model what configuration of field margins might just help biodiversity to move through a farm landscape and maybe persist? Well, actually, it's unlikely to persist when you've devoted 70% of the land to harmful intensive agriculture. So, it's literally tinkering at the margins of the problem. And really the elephant in the room is how do we transform this system? How do we get out of this fix we've got ourselves into? And that's, really becomes not just an ecological question. It starts to enter into economics, social sciences like psychology, understanding people's behaviours. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to come to Reading and be involved in leading a workshop where we worked with people. I was really pleased we got people from the Henley Business School, from the Department of Geography, Political Sciences, Agriculture, Biological Sciences. And we tried to think about ways to, what are the factors which prevent the transformation of the food system? And when I say food system, I don't just mean the production on farms or fishing, but actually the whole food system from retailing, manufacture, transport, this whole linked network with people, with jobs, with infrastructure, the whole network which allows food to go from farm to our forks. How do we transition that to a different state? You can see the enormity of the challenge, but we need to because it's not just affecting biodiversity, it's driving a large component of greenhouse gases. It's affecting fresh water quality, it's leading to pollution, health impacts. So there's a real challenge. In this interdisciplinary workshop, we started to think about what are the mechanisms that lock in the food system, that keep it trapped in this state. Now, there's a lot of information here. I'm not going to go through it in detail, don't worry. I just really want to highlight that there are lots of factors here. There are lots of mechanisms that are keeping that food system locked in the state that it is. And we need to not just work on one of them or two of them, we need to work on all of them. It's a bit like, I like to think of a beetle stuck on your woolly jumper, and you want to get the beetle off, and you lift a couple of legs off gently, you don't want to hurt it, you lift a couple of legs off, but then when you go to get those legs, these two have stuck back on, and then you go to get those, and this one's stuck. You need to lever all 6 legs off at the same time. And the same with the food system, we need to work on all these levers somehow together to get an effective transformation. Now, there's lots of levers, and one thing to point out is that they're spread across sectors and across disciplines as well. So we really need to work together, not in our siloed disciplines, to solve this problem. There's a whole set of mechanisms related to knowledge constraints. So, for example, lack of recognition of environmental impacts. Retailers might be selling unsustainable food, but how do they know? When you look at a packet of food, it's very difficult to say how damaging it is for the environment. Economic and regulatory constraints. Mark mentioned that I'm working at DEFRA at the moment, part of the UK government, Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And in DEFRA, they're very good at thinking about these economic and regulatory constraints, but arguably perhaps less good at some of these other factors. They're very aware of perverse subsidies. We pay farmers to farm in a way which is damaging the environment. We pay farmers to keep the landscape in a farmable state, which is actually a state which is bad for biodiversity. Coming out of the Common Agricultural Policy is an opportunity to transform that subsidy system to pay for public goods and not just to pay for owning land and keeping it in a state which is bad for biodiversity. And I'm going to jump across now to this side, which is more about ecology. I'm a bit more comfortable with this again. These are about factors such as insufficient pollinators and natural enemies. So we may want to farm in a way which is more sustainable, so using less pesticides and less fertilizers. But actually, if we've destroyed all the natural enemies, if we've lost the spiders and the ground beetles and the ladybirds, then actually we're kind of locked into using those pesticides. Otherwise, we're going to have really low yields. So we need to restore the habitats, get the species back in before we can start releasing our grip on the pesticides. Similarly for soil health, if we degraded the quality of the soil, we kind of rely on putting lots of chemical inputs in. So a whole set of biophysical constraints. But this is the area that I really want to focus on today, and this is about socio-cultural constraints. Because these are more about psychology, behavior, even philosophy, things that often get neglected in terms of these arguments about food systems. Here's an example of one, belief in techno-fixes. Some people think we don't need to solve the decline in pollinators. We don't need to solve that as a problem because we can just invent robotic pollinators. We literally, you may have seen actually people have invented little drones that fly between flowers, which is great, you've done that. But can you imagine scaling this up so that every flower in the whole world was pollinated by these little robots? And the tech geeks will say, well, hold on, what if we made them renewable? So they use renewable energy. They have little solar panels on their back, and who's going to assemble them? Well, what if they self-assembled? And then you say, well, actually, we've got those robots. They're biological robots. They're bees. They feed on renewable resources, and they self-assemble. So let's just look after the bees. But these techno-fixes, particularly for really thorny problems like climate change, as I mentioned, agriculture produces a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. Do we need to deal with that? What if we just put big mirrors in space? Maybe that will reduce heating of the Earth's surface, but it's not going to solve ocean acidification, which is caused by that dissolved carbon dioxide. And it's probably going to lead to a lot of other side effects as well. So these technical fixes, they seem very enticing, but actually they're often not solving the problem holistically. So that's one example. And the second one that I really want to focus on is this idea of limited collective identity. And this is really getting at kind of almost philosophy or ethics, because you might explain to someone the environment is declining, we need to protect the environment and save opportunities for future generations. And they might turn around and say, I don't care. I just care about me and my family, and I don't care about future generations or people on the other side of the world. Now that is a tricky argument because you can't rationally it's very difficult to have that rational argument. It's about values at the end of the day. So, and actually, there's worrying signs. In lots of countries, there was a study showing in 80 countries, studied over 50 years, those countries are getting stronger in individualistic values, and narcissism even is increasing in those countries. And if we have this increase in selfish behavior, then it's very difficult to encourage people to act less selfishly and protect the global commons and to think about the well-being of future generations. So this is hugely important. So coming back to my kind of abstract philosophical question, what is an individual? It does have really big applied meaning. It's not just about our personal well-being, which I'll come on to, but actually the health, not just of ourselves, but also of our planet, planetary health, and the health of our ecosystems. So let's just take a sidestep for now. Emma kindly sent around this questionnaire before, and some of you have kindly completed. That's great. Don't worry if you didn't get a chance, it's only actually one question, so you can think of the answer in your head now. And this is asking how connected to nature we feel. There's lots of different ways of surveying this now. Some have multiple questions. You can also get a handle on not just nature connectedness, but social connectedness. How much do people feel that their sense of self overlaps with other people, their family or their neighbours or the towns or even people on the other side of the world? We can start to quantify that sense of how our self-schema overlaps with others. So let's have a look then. Here are the results of the survey, your results. 175 people responded, and you can see here that whether there's the most common score is somewhere in the middle. Some overlap between ourselves and nature. We've got a few people here with complete overlap, and some people who obviously need to convince in terms of there is some overlap between ourselves and others. So, when you look at a natural scene like this is actually just 200 meters away on the footpath to agriculture. There's a bridge, and you can look at this. It's a beautiful scene. And do you see yourself and nature out there, or do you see yourself reflected in that nature? And these questionnaires get at that question itself. And that's important because, as I mentioned, it's perhaps a philosophical question. What is our sense of individuality, and how much do we see ourselves as discrete individuals? But these surveys are actually leading the way in quantifying that and allowing some empirical analysis and starting to tease apart some really interesting patterns. And that allows a better understanding of our sense of self. So I'm going to put the slides away for a moment. Let's just think about that question. What is the self, really? It's a bit abstract, isn't it? Let's think of something a bit more tangible. Okay, who here has picked their nose in the last month? Raise your hand, please. Raise your hand. Come on, be brave now. Okay, there's some brave people out there, but just for people's reference, I'm looking up probably about a quarter of the audience, I think, maybe 75 people put their hands up there. The rest, perhaps. Yeah. So it's difficult, though, isn't it? I mean, if you perhaps thought you should have put your hand up, but you didn't, how did it feel when I asked that question, asked you to raise your hand? Does it feel vulnerable? Do you feel a bit anxious, a bit embarrassed? Now, that's not surprising because we've got a reputation to maintain. We've got a sense of self to uphold. And we don't want to be actually, our sense of self, a large part of that sense of self is based on the narrative of how we think others perceive us. And we don't want to be the type of person that puts our hand up and admits to even a minor social taboo. But equally, how does it feel to always have to maintain that sense of self? Like there's a fortress with you inside and outside nearly 8 billion others. Is it ever draining to always have to maintain that image? Is it ever isolating or lonely? I just want to take a moment now just to experience loneliness, even in a room full of people, to feel like you're a complete stranger. And a lot of people feel like that all the time. And actually, research shows that anxiety, this sense of isolation, anxiety is increasing in our modern world in many countries. And self-harm amongst adolescents, depression. 16% of adults, that's 1 in 6 adults, are on antidepressants in the UK. And actually, some people are referring to this as a mental health epidemic. And hopefully, I hope to convince you, even maybe just start to convince you in a small way, that we don't actually, when you look at the science, we don't need to feel lonely ever again. But first, let's think about the nature of illusion. Okay. I'm not going to get my magician's hat now and perform an illusion for you. There are enough illusions in this room, I would argue, myself included. Now, an illusion is where we perceive something to be one way, but it's not true. You may be familiar with this visual illusion called the Penrose staircase. It was also made more famous by the artist M.C. Escher, who do these beautiful line drawings of these stairs. And you can put your finger on the page, and you can follow the stairs going up, and then they curve around, and you're following them going up, and then they curve again, still going up, and right back, still going up to where you started. Now we know rationally you can't keep going upstairs in a circle and not where you started. But this is the nature of the illusion. And our sense of self is a similar illusion. Our sense of self as a discrete, isolated entity is a similar illusion. And sometimes we might see through that illusion. We might see the truth rationally. But then we turn away or we get distracted. And when we look back, we're snapped back to seeing that illusion again. Now that's because our brains have evolved to perceive the world in a certain way. When we evolved in prehistoric times, it would have been beneficial to have a sense of self. Of course, it is still beneficial to have some kind of sense of self. In those early days, it would have allowed us to collate our memories into a coherent set so that we could remember how and where we would find food. It would allow us to track the complex interactions in our social groups. But if we became too selfish, if I was to steal food from the group or to spoil the camp, then I would be physically beaten, or I would be prevented from mating, or I would actually be excluded from the group, which would threaten my survival. So there's a series of checks and balances, kind of creating a balance between self-serving individuality and working more cooperative as part of a collective. Now let's zoom forward to the modern world. Our group sizes are not 100, 150 people, they're global. We can interact in digital networks, and I can speak to people on the other side of the world. Our economies are globalized. When I buy something, if I buy something with unsustainable palm oil, the impacts ripple across the world and lead to the destruction of rainforest habitats, driving climate change, losing pristine habitats, losing species like orangutans, for example. And actually, these changes, these choices, these selfish choices in a globalized economy lead to biodiversity loss, climate change, ocean acidification, air pollution. And that's threatening the environment. It's threatening the environment on which our future prosperity depends. And that's not a very sensible thing to do. So I think it's time to challenge, really, that illusion that we're independent selves, because it's leading to impacts on our personal well-being, and it's impacting our planetary well-being. But let me now give you some evidence that the self is indeed an illusion. I want you to take a deep breath now. Take a deep breath. Let's get some energy in the room. Feel the back of your chair as you breathe in and breathe out. That's it. And let's take one more breath. Fill your lungs up. And breathe out. Okay, I'm going to ask a question now. As you take a deep breath in, what are you breathing in? Does anyone want to volunteer an answer? What's in the composition? Obviously it's air, but what's in that air? Nitrogen, yeah, thank you. Oxygen, water, yeah. I'm hearing
incalculable numbers of injected chemicals.
Yeah, probably incalculable numbers, yeah. There are probably chemicals from these desks and the seats and nitrous oxides from the car exhausts outside, that's right. And also organic compounds as well. We shed from our bodies about 1 million particles every hour. So take a deep breath. You're breathing in everyone else right now. You're also breathing in molecules that were once part of plants and dinosaurs, sharks, turtles, lizards. So let me explain. So as you sit here right now, there are about 40 to 50 kilograms of oxygen in your body. The reason we don't all float around the room, which would be quite fun, is because that oxygen is bound with close intermolecular forces with hydrogen. And those forces between those water molecules maintain the density. But when our body dies, and we're buried or we're cremated, those bonds are broken and those molecules will start to dissipate and they'll start to separate. And let's just imagine that right now. Let's imagine that all the molecules in your body, 40 to 50 kilograms of oxygen, were to burst forth into the air of this room. They're in the room. They're creeping out of the doors. They're creeping out the front door and they're spreading amongst the Earth's atmosphere, 100 kilometers high, stretching around the entire Earth. So I'm going to ask a question now. All those molecules spread around the entire Earth. How far apart would those molecules be? 40 to 50 kilograms that were in your body are now dispersed equally amongst the entire atmosphere of Earth. Does anyone want to hazard a guess? 10 meters? 1 meter? 100 milliliters? 100 millimeters, sorry. The answer is 0.3 millimeters. So in 1 cubic meter, that's about this big. From anywhere in the Earth's atmosphere, there are 27 million molecules of oxygen that were once part of your body. So a dense fog of molecules, and that's mingling with a dense fog of molecules that were once part of other animals and plants. Turtles, shrews, wallabies, snails. Take a deep breath. You're breathing in a zoological legacy. You're also breathing in bacteria, because we've got lots of bacteria, of course, in our bodies. There are about 440 species of bacteria on our elbow joints. Open your mouth. There are about 1,000 species of bacteria in your mouth. Behind our ears, there's about 125 species. That depends on how often you wash, of course. And we've got bacteria inside us, in our guts. You've probably all read, those bacteria can affect our moods and our behaviors, again, detracting from our supposed individual autonomy. And those bacteria are on our body. In fact, we have more bacterial cells in and on our body than human cells. There are 38 trillion bacterial cells and 37 trillion human cells. Now, they're shedding off our body right now. So take a deep breath. You're breathing in those bacteria. And actually, around each person now, there's a cloud of bacteria. And that has it's your own microbial signature. So you could take a sample of that air, and using some quite advanced DNA sequencing techniques, you could see what microbes are there. And that would be individual. That would be your unique fingerprint for you. So you're breathing in each other's unique bacterial fingerprint right now. But don't feel, they're not alien to us, really. I mean, we're actually very closely related to those bacteria. We're closely related to each other, of course. We share about 99.9% of our genetic code with other people in this room. You've probably heard we share about 95% with chimpanzees. I don't think there are any here. But we share about 37% with bacteria. And there are some here. There's some just here, bacteria. And they're floating above my hand. And your genetic code that's inside your cells is similar to this bacteria. 37%, not just similar, in fact, the same DNA, 37% of that DNA is in this bacteria right now. And it's not just the similarity in our genetics with these bacteria, they're actually, inside our human cells, we have mitochondria. Now, these are the powerhouses of the cell. Okay, they create the energy that allows us to move around. And those bacteria actually were originally single-celled bacteria-type organisms, and they were engulfed by another cell, and that created the eukaryotic, they're called, cellular organisms that went on to form animals and human life. So we are densely interwoven with these bacteria. We're a chimera of human and bacteria. So for the last time, take a deep breath. Breathe them all in. It's fine. So physically, we're hugely interconnected. We have these cells on our body. They're only with us a few weeks, some a few months. But when we look in the mirror, our physical bodies, there's a turnover of these cells. But what keeps your body looking like you when you look in the mirror is your DNA, scavenging materials from the environment and building this structure. But that DNA is just borrowed from our ancestors, and we pass it on to our ancestors to come, and we share it with everyone else in the room. So really, it's very difficult to say that there is a distinct physical entity, which is you. It's very difficult to draw a clear line around that entity. But what about psychologically? Here, in my head. Come on, that's me, surely. In my head, that's me. That's discrete me. But actually, every touch, every word, every pheromone that we receive from others alters the neural networks in our brains and changes the person that we are. You're not the same person that you were 1 year ago, but equally you're not the same person that you were when you walked into this room. And science of social networks is showing how ideas, beliefs, preferences flow so fluidly between one person and the next that it's very difficult to say where one mind ends and another begins. You can influence people, their voting preferences, their music taste, their risk of obesity, without even meeting them through these social networks. Let me give you, psychologically, we're very connected. Our minds are not distinct entities. They're porous. They're linked between us. Let me give you one final example. We like to think of inventors as lone geniuses. But did you know that the telephone, the hypodermic needle, the steamboat were all invented simultaneously in multiple locations? In some cases, patents filed within weeks of inventions, and in some cases on the same day, patents submitted in different countries. So inventors aren't just great minds. They're not great minds working independently. They're often just taking the almost inevitable next step in a series of interdependent innovations. And innovation is part of a great linked creative human endeavor. So physically, we're hugely connected, and psychologically, we're connected. It's very difficult to draw a clear line around the self. And I just want to kind of start to wrap up by talking about the benefits of appreciating that sense of connectedness. Because when we feel less isolated, research shows that we tend to be happier, we're less anxious, have lower incidence of depression. And when we feel more connected to nature, we also tend to be happier, and we show more pro-environmental behaviors. So that's reducing our carbon footprint, or buying sustainably, or volunteering for environmental causes. And that's really important. We really need that kind of pro-environmental behavior at the moment. As I mentioned, we're in the face of a global environmental crisis: air pollution, climate change, biodiversity loss. These are driven by our individual actions, our individual behaviors, attitudes, and mindsets. And those choices, how we choose to travel, what we choose to buy, they cause impacts on the world. And multiplied almost 8 billion times, that creates vast tidal waves of impacts, which is driving this environmental degradation. So if we want to get to the root causes and the root solutions of these problems, we need to think about changing those mindsets. People often like to think about solutions at the more proximate level. Put a tax on carbon or create a new environmental regulation. And these are all really important tools. But we should recognize that it's our individual behaviors that are causing the demand, this unsustainable consumption, which is leading to this environmental degradation. So we really need to address the root cause of these problems. And also, we think about these institutions, economic institutions, justice systems, legislative systems. They're actually just made of our worldviews, our collective worldviews, past and present. And if we want to change those institutions, we need to change our mindsets. So coming back to this question that I asked at the start as a youngster, sort of philosophical question, what is an individual? Hopefully I've convinced you that it's hugely important. It's important for our personal well-being, and it's important for our planetary well-being as well. That underpins our prosperity. And if there's one message that I would hope that you might take away from today, in fact, it's not a message, it's a feeling. It's that feeling of interconnectedness, and it's that feeling of being connected and the well-being benefits that it can give. But also realizing that those big global problems that seem so intractable, actually the solutions lie within us right now. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Matt.
So I very much enjoyed that talk, and I hope everybody else did as well. I think the applause says that that you did. Carl Sagan said that we're all made of stardust. I was sort of sitting there and thinking, according to Tom, maybe we're made of each other. And I'm not sure which is more romantic. In a way, perhaps Tom's view, even though it's a little bit less poetic in some ways. Again, just thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I think it gave us a lot to think about, as we went through from the environment side, conservation, the damage that the world and the challenges that the world is facing, through to our own place in that. So there's opportunities now for you all to ask questions. Please do. There's 2 microphones going around, so if you put a hand up, the microphone will come to you.
So thanks a lot for that. I genuinely really loved it, and I think a lot of academics nowadays are blinded by their own narrow area of research. So what you did was brilliant. But being a kind of interdisciplinary researcher myself, I wanted to take it a bit further on 2 more levels. So I'm a physicist, and the idea that free will is not actually true is quite a common concept within physics. So we all travel through space-time in a straight line. So we don't actually have free will. It's quite a common concept. So that kind of fits in with what you were saying about being part of a bigger collective. But also on a political point, could what you were saying go too far about, for example, the ideas of the collective being more important than the individual, which was basically the extreme left-wing ideology in communist places, which then makes people unhappy. So could it go too far?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, thanks that point. I'm going to definitely avoid the free will question, because I think that's one really for the bar afterwards, perhaps. But I will come to about the question about the degree of collectivism versus individualism and getting the balance right. And I'm certainly not. I don't want you to get me wrong and think that I'm suggesting that we should be completely collectivist and forget about the individual, because actually we need that individual to function. If we take loads of LSD and completely lose our sense of individuality, we just bumble around. We can't really get on in the world and actually do anything. I haven't tried, don't worry. But equally, I think we've pushed too far along that continuum towards that sense of self-serving individuality. And I think it's about kind of recognizing that and pulling back and thinking a bit more collectively. So it's trying to find where the balance is right. And I think our cultures have not helped really, because I talked a little bit about how we've evolved a sense of self, and actually in the modern world it's become kind of detrimental or maladaptive. But actually that's been exacerbated by our culture as well. Our education systems telling us to build self-esteem or even to sell ourselves as a personal brand, or our media telling you, you're worth it, or our governments telling, Margaret Thatcher famously saying there's no such thing as society, only individuals and their families. And our minds, swim in this culture and we soak it up, and it changes the way we think. And that's really exacerbated the problem. And an analogy here is, our craving for fatty foods. When we evolved, it would have been beneficial to seek out those food sources. They were high-value food sources. But actually, in the modern world, that's become maladaptive, and it's been exacerbated by a culture where, those foods are widely available and accessible and cheap, and they're everywhere you go. So that's a similar issue, I think. There's a kind of a combination between biological evolution and cultural evolution, and they've kind of they're in this kind of waltz which is out of control, and we need to kind of recognize that and start to, rationally address that. The result of the obesity, the craving for sugary foods is an obesity crisis. 2 billion people are overweight or obese, whilst another 2 billion are malnourished. And so, but actually there are some shoots of hope that actually that can be addressed when we start to realize the problem, how culture and biological evolution are kind of entwined. We can start to rationally put our kind of, prefrontal cortex, get it going and really think about these issues and start to steer ourselves towards a kind of more, a better balance between that collective and individual.
Thank you. It's really to build on that, because I think the really key word that we can see for me is delusion. And if delusion has a selective advantage, I think it's really difficult to counter that. So I just think if we're programmed evolutionarily to be deluded, which I believe we are. How do we counter that now that we've moved on from the Stone Age, and we're now in a society which accepts all this delusion? How do we move on from that? It's difficult, I think.
You're right. I mean, it's very difficult to kind of get out of this culture that surrounds us. As I said, our minds soak it up like a sponge, and also if we're predispositioned to think that way anyway, to think we're individual, isolated self, it's very difficult. But I think that's where previous there's in a sense to this talk, the key message. There's not a lot new. A lot of Buddhist traditions, Eastern traditions, even Christianity, some of the Gnostic traditions have taught that the individual is an illusion. But actually, I suppose what's slightly new is bringing the evidence. Rather than just someone telling you, yourself is an illusion. This, presenting the scientific evidence, whether it's from biology, neuroscience, psychology, and combining that together to really look at it and see actually the proof is there. That there is this kind of illusion. And when you look at global sustainability, you can see that it's a harmful illusion and it's driving these environmental degradation. So I think the evidence is there. Now, just knowing it rationally is one thing, and I don't think that's the full solution. And I hope people do get engaged in the book and discuss the ideas. But I don't think necessarily, well, perhaps, but I don't think we're going to read it and all become enlightened. I wish we could. Because if you think, it's a bit like me saying, I'm going to explain to you how an Olympic archer can fire an arrow and hit the target 100 meters away. I can explain it to you in absolute detail, how all the muscle fibers work. But actually, if I then try and do it, or you try and do it, I don't know, maybe you're an Olympic archer, but I'm not. If I try and do it, I won't be able to. Because it's about training those neural networks. And actually in our brain, our thought patterns are like, they are neural networks, and they're like well-worn tracks, and we're used to thinking in a certain way. And if we want to think in a different way, we've got to work hard to train that. So there are ways to do that, and I do touch on that in the book, meditation techniques. There's a lot of science showing this can be effective in actually changing the neural networks in the brain. So, neuroscience studies combined with these meditation approaches, creating some really novel insights. That's not the only solution. There are other, outdoor community pursuits. Work in an outdoor environment with other people can actually improve sense of empathy and compassion. And also even computer games now can be designed, or books can be designed to create, to change the way people think. And that, people have started to measure that. We can sort of start to quantify and take an evidence-based spirituality, let's say, rather than just someone telling you it's true. Let's apply the science to it as well.
There's one in the middle, at the back. No, not that one.
Just following that, I thought part of the answer about adapting, if the delusion is seems ill-adapted, but I thought you gave the answer in why that matters. You answered that in terms of personal advantages, which would then, that would be adaptive. But if you, even in your delusion, you behave in a way that is helping your health and so forth, that would be adaptive and an evolutionary trait that would be picked on.
Yeah.
But it's not a question, it's just a sort of observation that part of the answer was.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And just to build on that, I guess, is that I think there is a danger, though, that there'll be cheats in any system. And there's some nice research in biology that shows that animals can work cooperatively, but you get more cheats when the group size gets bigger, because it's easier to get away with it. It's very difficult to kind of police when there's big group sizes. And so this is part of my thesis, I suppose, to explain why, when we're in these small human groups, everyone's watching each other. It's very difficult to get away with cheating, selfish behaviour. But actually, when the groups get larger, if I damage something on the other side of the world by I know I'm doing it. Let's say if I buy a product, you could argue I'm willfully doing it, and I'm aware that I'm damaging that habitat. But who's going to stop me? There's no one's going to come and tell me off. In fact, our legal frameworks and our moral frameworks haven't kept up with the pace of economic globalization, and we're still catching up. So I think there's a real need there. But there's a Norwegian philosopher called Arne Naess, and he came up with this idea of the ecological self, that if people have a sense of self, which as I've described, which is broader, bigger than just this little me in a body, but actually encompasses not just my family or my town, but not just my nation, but the whole world, then maybe helping someone on the other side of the world is not an altruistic act. An altruistic act is doing something which is costly to me, but helps them. It's hard to convince someone to do that because it's costly. But if you see yourself in that other person or that creature, actually looking after them is an act of self-care. I mean, think of your family, helping your son or your daughter. You wouldn't think of it as an altruistic act. You do it as a kind of because you identify them. So can we have that group, that in-group that we have as our close family, can we extend it to be bigger and have the whole world? Now, it's an open question. It's difficult because actually an in-group, we usually have an out-group. So like a football team, they all stick together in Chelsea because they're not Man United so that having an out-group creates in-group cohesiveness. So can you have an in-group, which is the whole world, with no out-group? That's what Arne Naess was suggesting. But actually, it's encouraging that environmental psychology research that I talked about right at the end, saying that when people feel more connected to nature and they have this sense of an ecological self, they tend to have more pro-environmental behaviours. So it seems he was right. He came up with this theory in the 80s, but actually it seems now research has proven him correct, that when we do have this bigger identity, and even if there's no out-group, we feel global citizens, we still actually act and protect those others beyond us.
Okay, sorry. There was somebody at the back who's had their hand up for a couple of times.
So I wanted to draw you on practical application. If you were to think about all of the research that you've done, what one thing could you suggest to this audience tonight, one small change that they could make in their own lives in order to improve the situation, other than buy your book?
You answered it for me. All good bookshops, especially one for an independent bookshop. That's a really good question. And if I was more prepared, I would have a well-crafted answer. And unfortunately, I don't. I think that practice is the key. I think, understanding the issue rationally is step one, and practice is the next step. So I think, beyond becoming aware of the science around our interconnectedness, I would probably say, practical application, sort of mindfulness, meditation approaches have been shown to be effective. It's not my research, I can't claim it, certainly, but that would be the one thing I would recommend, probably. Just because there's so much evidence at the moment. There may be other things as well, but...
Okay, so there's a...
Just a connected question.
Sorry, could you wait for somebody to come down with a microphone? And it's on its way, and... Why don't we do both of you? We'll take turns. This is good. Otherwise, it'll be hogged by the back. So it's a...
Thank you. Very inspiring talk you did, and thanks for that. There's two things to my point. Several years ago, as a younger person, I was brought up in Lincolnshire, farming territory. Go out on your motorbike or your car, and you come back, and the windscreen or your helmet would be plastered in insects. Now I'm living in the south, it doesn't happen. And I'm not sure, have the insects all disappeared? What's happened with that? The other thing is on anxiety and psychological issues. I've found, and also talking to other people, and it's not deep research, that taking an interest in nature, like watching how bees pollinate, watching birds nest, looking at the beauty and structure of flowers can be very, very therapeutic and can lift people out of depression. And so, perhaps that's a recommendation for people who have personal problems and not feeling so isolated by doing that.
Certainly, yeah. I think on the first point, I think there is good evidence of insect declines. There's still lots of analyses being done, and some have different results because they use different types of data. It's quite difficult to get down exact figures. But there's clear evidence that insects are declining, although not at the kind of Insectageddon, Armageddon rate. There's a lot of sensationalism about the declines. And there's been a few studies in certain countries that have said there have been 70% declines in 10 years. That's not the case for the UK, but it is a slow burn problem, and we do need to address it because we know that these insects are important. So that's probably explaining the lack of insects on your car window. Also, cars have become more streamlined, so there's probably less. So there's a combination. But yeah, I mean, on the second point, getting out in nature and being involved, lots of evidence for that, improves nature connectedness and has all these benefits. So meditating in nature, even better, yeah.
And then at the front.
It was just a connected question to the one previous, that I was wondering whether writing this book has changed anything in the way you personally live or your family now live.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. I think if you're going to talk the talk, you've got to start walking the walk for one aspect. But on a more serious note, I think it was great to start putting these things together because, if you have a passion for science and learning generally from a young age, as you become more specialised in academia, it can start to lose the kind of passion because it's so specialised. And actually, writing this book was going back to some of the sort of A-level, physics, biology, and actually that for me was great. And also, I think understanding that connectedness more and bringing the evidence to bear as I started to put the pieces together. As I was saying to Jonathan, in the talk I talked about having a passion for nature from a young age. And what I didn't say, I always had a passion from when I was about 12 for kind of reading about Eastern, Buddhist practices and Zen. And I was really interested in meditation, all these kinds of approaches. And it was only when I started writing this book that the two started to come in together and realizing actually this could provide the evidence underpinning what these kind of traditions are saying is true. And so that to me was quite a change, and yeah, I think it's I try to develop trying to develop these ideas more and also become more pro-environmental in my own behaviours as well.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question over here. Sorry, unfortunately, I was gazing up. It's difficult because it's so raked here. It's so easy not to catch people's eyes.
I should say,
if we don't hit 22, I'll make sure you get your chance.
And please feel free to drop me a line if you have questions or suggestions or comments. And, yeah.
Relating to your question about what would we do as individuals, and harking back to your earlier comment, not only that we're connected, but that there are multiple constraints and it's difficult to move one without another. I think some people have more ability to change than others. I'm thinking of politicians, for example. Now, most politicians are not scientists. Any scientist, even with only O-level qualifications, could tell you after a few moments' thought, perpetual growth in a finite system is impossible. Politicians and economists not only believe it's possible, but their whole theory is based on the assumption that it's necessary. In that environment, how can we make any progress until we can crack through the idea that we must have perpetual growth?
Yeah. So, no, I think
economic, population, production, you name it.
Yeah. I think it's a good point that it's difficult to shift people's mindsets, especially when we're kind of stuck with a certain type of view. I think there's hope because it's like learning a new skill like piano. It's more difficult if you're older. I mean, you're literally reprogramming neural networks, but it's still possible. But you try, children doing it, pick it up much easier. So actually, there's a lot more hope as well, thinking about future generations. And actually, I truly think there'll be in 10 years, 15 years from now, youngsters will be thinking differently and have a much more different type of ecological, more ecological consciousness than we do. And I think that's a great hope. Also, because we're connected and there's this contagion of behaviours and ideas and preferences, as a few people start to change and see the world in a new way, that can cascade and you can get potentially these tipping points where you get mass changes. And I think perhaps we're starting to see that with awareness about climate change and then following that will be hopefully action on climate change. So I think there is hope that it seems so daunting and it seems such a big problem. There's only 1% who are aware of it and doing anything and 99% that are not. But we all know that change can come very quickly in social and ecological systems. So those tipping points can occur. So.
I think we have the time. There you go. We'll squeeze it in. It's just here. Yep.
Thanks a lot. Tom, I'm glad I waited. My question was, what's your perspective on the influence of groups such as XR versus national government into the future?
So I think those groups can be hugely powerful in terms of sort of changing the window of what's politically possible. And I think and also kind of providing a ground for new ways of thinking and new ways of dealing with problems. My feeling is that you have to engage in a system rather than just stand and try to kind of object to it. But equally, I really value what they're doing. So in my DEFRA role, for example, I've been trying to engage the system and create positive change, but also meeting, for example, Extinction Rebellion, talking about their Citizen Assembly working group and how we can have a more deliberative, evidence-based or evidence-informed participatory democracy to solve these big problems, because we can't solve them all top-down in some very technical approach. We have to think about, these are huge changes that we need, huge transitions of our food system, mobility system, energy system. And, there are going to be losers, and we need to understand who those losers might be, how we buffer them, how we kind of, transition as a group and get that buy-in from everyone, so it has ownership from society. So I think that's hugely important to engage those groups as well. Can I just to say, take a quick opportunity to say thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your time, and please do drop me a line if you've got any questions. And thanks to Reading and the team for promoting the event, and Wallingford Bookshop. And last favour to ask you, if you do happen to read the book and you like it, please put a positive review on Amazon, because it will help to create discussion of those ideas. If you don't like it, then don't put a review. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you again, Tom. That was fantastic. And I think the quality of the questions that came from the audience really just shone a light on how fascinating people thought your talk was. And I think they took a lot away from it. It was difficult, I have to admit, standing here, not to sort of interject and go, but and start asking my own questions. Later, I'll get you later. Tom has already done the sales pitch. It's a very pretty book, and it's outside in the foyer. Tom will, I'm sure, also sign them for you if you'd like that. He has a list of inscriptions he can put in. Before I finish, though, just to let everybody know that we have the next talk in the series, the next public lecture, is on the 18th of March. It's going to be delivered by Professor Cathy Payne. It's on a rather different topic, even though I'm sure some of the audience will be back again to hear it. It's entitled From Biscuits to Big Tech, Reading's Rise to Economic Prosperity. So there you go. It's a really different sort of subject area. With that, I'd just like to thank you all again once more for coming, and I'd like to thank Tom for something that we'll think about for a long time. So thank you.